Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today we're diving into the moment Mrs. Land thought she'd finally found peace, until a bank notice revealed someone tried to change her old account behind her back. What happens next will test everything they've worked for. If you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next episodes. The next morning, the house didn't feel happy, it felt stable. And after everything they'd been through, that alone was a miracle. Tu Tieu woke to quiet sounds, water running in the kitchen, a cabinet closing softly, the gentle scrape of a chair on the floor. No frantic footsteps, no whispered panic, no phone buzzing like a warning siren. She walked out and found Mrs. Lan at the table with a mug of warm water in both hands, staring out the window as if she was learning how to breathe again. Uri stood at the counter, calm as always, reading a letter with the kind of focus that made Tu Tieu's stomach tighten before he even spoke. He looked up. "It's real," he said. Tu Tieu sat down slowly. "The bank letter?" Uri nodded. "They're requesting a signature to update authorization on an old account." Mrs. Land's fingers tightened around her mug. "I haven't touched that account in years," she whispered. "I forgot it even existed." "That's why it's dangerous," Uri said, not harsh, just clear. "Old accounts are like unlocked windows. People assume no one will check." Tu Tieu leaned forward. "What does the letter say exactly?" Uri slid it toward her. "Recent activity. They won't give details in writing, but they want the account holder to come in person with ID." Mrs. Land's face went pale again. Not because anyone was in the room with them, not because there was a confrontation, but because paperwork was the kind of ghost that could still reach into their lives without knocking. Tu Tieu took a slow breath. "Okay," she said, voice steady. "We go today?" Mrs. Land blinked. "Today?" "Yes," Tu Tieu said. "If we wait, your mind will spiral, and we're not living like that anymore." Uri gave a small nod, approval in his eyes. "We go this morning. We bring documents. We ask the right questions. We close the last loose end." Mrs. Land's lips trembled. "I'm scared." Tu Tieu reached across the table and covered her mother's hand. "I know," she said gently, "but you're not doing it alone." Mrs. Land looked down at their hands like she didn't deserve the comfort. "I don't want to be weak," she whispered. Uri spoke softly. "This isn't weakness. It's your nervous system catching up after years of stress. Fear doesn't mean you're failing," Tu Tieu nodded. "We already made the plan, remember?" Mrs. Land swallowed. "The plan," Tu Tieu's voice softened. "And we have the code word." Mrs. Land exhaled shakily. "Oxygen." Uri set his keys on the table. "Good," he said. "And we'll use it before anyone gets overwhelmed." He moved with quiet efficiency, pulling a folder from the cabinet. Copies of Mrs. Land's ID, proof of address, a printed list of questions. He even had a simple checklist like he'd done this 100 times. Tu Tieu stared at him. "You wrote questions?" Uri didn't look up. "Banks have scripts. If we don't bring our own script, we'll leave with half answers." Mrs. Land looked embarrassed. "I wouldn't even know what to ask." "That's why I'm here," Uri said, "and why Tu Tieu is here." Tu Tieu stood and grabbed her coat. "Let's do it," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. Because the truth was she hated banks right now, not because of money, because banks meant signatures, and signatures meant how easily someone could change the shape of your life without touching you. The bank was bright in a way that felt cold. Clean floors, white walls, glass partitions, people standing in quiet lines with polite faces. It was everyday life. And that's what made it unnerving. Life-altering things could happen here while someone else was picking up a debit card replacement. Mrs. Land clutched her purse close, shoulders tight. Tu Tieu walked on her left side, Uri on her right, a triangle of safety. At the counter, a bank representative greeted them with a practiced smile. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" Uri spoke first. "Mrs. Lan received a notice about activity on an old account," he said. "We need account details, verification of any recent changes, and we want to update security and authorization immediately." The representative's smile softened into professional seriousness. Of course. Mum, may I see your ID? Mrs. Land's hands shook as she handed it over. Tu Tieu watched her mother's face closely. She could see the fight happening inside, fear versus resolve. The representative typed for a moment, then paused. I do see notes on the account, she said carefully. There was a request made recently to update contact information. Mrs. Land's breath caught. Update? By who? The representative lifted her eyes, cautious. I can't disclose names unless they're authorized, but I can tell you the request did not complete because it failed verification. Tu Tieu felt her spine go cold. Yuri's voice stayed calm. What verification failed? It didn't match ID records, the representative said, so it was flagged. Mrs. Land pressed a hand to her chest. So someone tried. Tu Tieu tightened her grip on her mother's elbow, steadying her without drawing attention. Yuri leaned slightly forward. We'd like to place additional security, he said. 2-step verification, alerts, and a note requiring in-person identity check for any change. Yes, the representative nodded. We can do that. Mrs. Land's eyes glistened. Can I close the account? The representative blinked, then nodded. Yes, ma'am. If you'd like to close it, we can. We'll need to confirm balance and transfer any remaining funds. Tu Tieu's heart pounded. Mum, she whispered, whatever makes you feel safest. Mrs. Land's lips trembled. She looked at the counter, the papers, the bright lights. Then she lifted her chin. I want to close it, she said. Today. Something in Tu Tieu's chest loosened. Not because money was moving, but because her mother was choosing safety with her whole voice, not just a whisper. The representative printed forms and slid them forward. We'll just need your signature here, here, and here. Mrs. Land stared at the pen like it was heavy. Tu Tieu leaned in. Mum, breathe. Mrs. Land inhaled, shaky. Then she whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer. Oxygen. Yuri nodded, eyes steady on her. Good. Slow. One line at a time. Mrs. Land picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, but it moved. She signed, then signed again, then once more, and each signature was different from the old ones. These weren't written out of guilt or fear. These were written out of protection. When it was done, the representative gathered the papers. Okay, she said kindly. The account will be closed today. You'll receive confirmation by mail. And I'm adding a fraud alert note to your profile for any future inquiries. Mrs. Lan exhaled a breath she'd been holding for years. Tu Tieu surprised herself by smiling, small and watery. Yuri's voice stayed even. We also want to confirm there are no linked accounts, no automatic transfers, no authorized users. The representative checked. No linked accounts, she confirmed. No authorized users on file. Mrs. Land's eyes closed briefly, relief washing through her face. When she opened them, they were still wet but calmer. Tu Tieu squeezed her hand. You did it, she whispered. Mrs. Land's voice cracked. I did. As they walked out of the bank, sunlight hit the sidewalk in a pale winter glow, bright but soft, not harsh. Tu Tieu realized her shoulders had been up near her ears the whole time. She forced them down. Mrs. Lan looked up at the sky. I feel lighter, she whispered, like she was afraid to jinx it. Yuri nodded. Because you closed the last open door. Tu Tieu hesitated. Is it really the last door? Yuri's gaze met hers. It's the last paper door we know about, which is why we keep checking calmly one by one, not with fear, just with discipline. Mrs. Lan wiped her cheeks with a tissue. I'm sorry, she said suddenly. Tu Tieu blinked. For what? For needing you to hold my hand through this, Mrs. Lan whispered. A mother should be holding her daughter's hand, not the other way round. Tu Tieu's throat tightened. Mum, she said softly, today, you held mine too. You chose me again. That counts. Mrs. Lan swallowed hard. I'm trying to learn how. Yuri looked at both of them. Then we mark it, he said. Something small, something normal. Tu Tieu frowned. Like what? Yuri pointed across the street to a quiet little cafe with large windows and simple chairs. Tea, he said. 10 minutes, no heavy talk, just proof that life continues. Mrs. Lan hesitated. Tu Tieu could see the old instinct. Don't relax. Something might happen. Tu Tieu squeezed her mother's hand once. We can sit by the window, she offered, where you can see outside, if that helps. Mrs. Lan nodded slowly. Okay. They crossed the street together, and for the first time in a long time, Tu Tieu noticed something she hadn't dared to notice before. Her mother was walking without flinching at every sound. Not perfectly, but better. Inside the cafe, they chose a table near the window. Mrs. Lan wrapped her hands around a warm cup and stared at the steam like it was a promise. Yuri leaned back in his chair, quiet, letting the women breathe. Tu Tieu looked at her mother carefully. How do you feel? She asked. Mrs. Lan's eyes filled again, but this time the tears didn't look like panic. Proud, she whispered, and sad. Tu Tieu nodded. Both can be true. Mrs. Lan glanced at her. Are you still afraid I'll break? Tu Tieu paused, honest. A little, she admitted, but less than yesterday. Mrs. Lan nodded slowly, accepting that truth without arguing. Then she reached across the table and did something she'd rarely done before. She held Tu Tieu's hand first. I won't make you compete for me again, Mrs. Lan whispered. Tu Tieu's breath caught. Because that sentence wasn't a dramatic promise. It was a quiet one. And quiet promises, kept consistently, were exactly what healing looked like. They stayed at the cafe only a few minutes. Mrs. Lan held her cup with both hands, watching the steam rise. Tu Tieu watched her mother's shoulders lower little by little, as if her body was learning, minute by minute, that nothing bad was about to happen. Finally, Mrs. Lan whispered, almost surprised, My hands stopped shaking. Tu Tieu nodded. That's progress. It feels small, Mrs. Lan admitted. Yuri answered calmly. Small is how the nervous system learns. Mrs. Lan looked at Tu Tieu's fingers wrapped around her own. I meant what I said, she murmured. I won't make you compete for me again. Tu Tieu swallowed. I want to believe you, she said honestly. I just need time. Mrs. Lan nodded. You deserve time. Yuri glanced at his watch. Home. We prep. Tomorrow we handle the bank. Mrs. Lan's face tightened. We really have to go. Yes, Tu Tieu said gently, to close the last door. Back at home, Yuri spread papers across the kitchen table. IDs, proof of address, the bank notice, and a short checklist in his neat handwriting. Tu Tieu skimmed it. You wrote questions. Yuri didn't look up. Banks have scripts. We bring our own. Mrs. Lan sat down slowly, palms flat on the table. I feel embarrassed, she confessed. I should have managed my finances better. Tu Tieu shook her head. A lot of people have old accounts they forget about, especially when life gets complicated. Mrs. Lan's eyes filled. Normal doesn't feel normal to me anymore. Yuri pointed to the checklist. We request the date and time of the attempt, what fields were targeted, and a summary record. Then we add protections, password, in-person verification, alerts, and we close the account. Mrs. Lan stared at the words. What if it was someone I know? Tu Tieu kept her voice calm. Then we don't guess, we document. Yuri nodded. Emotion later, evidence first. Mrs. Lan whispered, Oxygen. Tu Tieu covered her mother's hand. Oxygen. That evening they kept the house simple on purpose. Yuri cooked something warm. Tu Tieu set the table. Mrs. Lan stirred soup, her movements careful, like if she kept her hands busy her thoughts wouldn't drag her back into guilt. After dinner Yuri tapped the notepad. 10-minute check-in. Tu Tieu read her one sentence. Hard. My body still jumps. Safe. Being with you. Need. Sleep. Mrs. Lan's voice shook but held. Hard. Guilt. Safe. Holding Tu Tieu's hand today. Need. Courage for tomorrow. Yuri nodded once. Hard. Watching old wounds reopen. Safe. Structure. Need. Patience. Then he closed the notepad. Done! Mrs. Lan went to the living room shelf and adjusted the photo frame, Tu Tieu as a child, so it faced the doorway. She turned back with wet eyes. "I want this house to remember you first," she whispered. Tu Tieu's throat tightened. "Thank you." Mrs. Lan sat beside her on the sofa, closer than usual. Her hand rested lightly on Tu Tieu's forearm. "I used to think love meant keeping the door open," Mrs. Lan said. Tu Tieu looked at her. "And now?" "Mrs." Lan's voice broke, but it held. "Now I think love means choosing the right person, even when guilt screams." Tu Tieu nodded slowly. "That's the kind of love I can trust." The next morning they went early. Uri approached the desk and placed the notice down. "We received this. We need details on the attempted update and we want to close the account today." The representative typed, then paused. "I see a flagged online request," she said carefully. It attempted to update contact information. Mrs. Lan's breath caught. "Online? I never use online banking for that account." "That's why it was flagged," the representative replied. "Verification failed, so no changes were completed." Tu Tieu leaned toward her mother. "They reached for a locked door," she whispered, "and it didn't open." "Mrs." Lan's hands started to tremble. "Oxygen," she breathed. Tu Tieu covered her fingers. "Oxygen." Uri stayed steady. "Can you provide a summary record?" he asked. "Date, time, and what was targeted." "We can print a summary," the representative said. "The printer Word." Mrs. Lan stared at the desktop, blinking fast. "So someone tried to reach into my life," she whispered. "Yes," Uri said, "and today you take the keys back." The representative returned with a sheet and slid it over. Uri read it quickly, then nodded. "Add a verbal password. Require in-person verification for any changes. Turn on alerts, and then we close the account." The representative nodded. "We can do that. We also recommend a fraud alert if you're concerned." Mrs. Lan looked up, voice shaky but firm. "I am concerned. I want to protect my life." The representative slid a pamphlet across the desk. "If you're worried about identity misuse," she added, "consider a fraud alert or a credit freeze. It helps prevent new accounts from being opened without you." Mrs. Lan stared at the pamphlet like it was another language. "I don't know how to do any of that," she admitted. Uri answered gently. "We'll do it step by step. After this, we pull your credit report, we place a fraud alert and we update your passwords. One afternoon. No rushing." Tu Tieu nodded. "And we'll keep the list on the fridge," she said, "so nothing gets missed." Mrs. Lan let out a shaky laugh. "You two make it sound manageable." "It is manageable," Uri said. "That's the point. The past feels huge because it's vague. When it becomes a checklist, it shrinks." Forms were placed in front of her. Mrs. Lan picked up the pen. Her hand trembled, but her jaw set. She signed, then signed again. When she finished, the representative said, "The account will close today. Any remaining funds will transfer to your primary account. In-person ID is required for changes." Mrs. Lan exhaled a long breath. Uri asked one last question. "Please confirm her main profile address is correct, and add a note. No changes without in-person ID." "Done," the representative said. They stood to leave. Mrs. Lan paused by the door and looked at Tu Tieu with wet eyes. "I didn't run," she whispered. Tu Tieu smiled through tears. "You didn't." Outside, the air was cold, but the sky felt open. Uri spoke quietly. "Today you proved something." Mrs. Lan opened her eyes. "What?" "That guilt doesn't drive the car anymore," Uri said. Mrs. Lan turned to Tu Tieu and took her daughter's hands in both of hers. "I choose you," she whispered, "and I will keep choosing you, even on the days it's hard." Tu Tieu's throat burned. She squeezed back. "Then we'll keep building," she whispered, "one boring day at a time." As they walked to the car, Mrs. Lan's phone buzzed, an automated notification confirming the closure request. She looked at the screen, then looked at Tu Tieu. For the first time, she didn't flinch. She smiled, small but real, and Tu Tieu realized The past didn't disappear. It just lost its keys. After signing a strict no-contact agreement, Mrs. Lan expects relief, but peace is fragile. A bank envelope warns of recent activity on an old, forgotten account. With Tu Tieu and Yuri at her side, Mrs. Lan goes to the bank to uncover what happened. Staff confirm an online request tried to change her contact information, but failed verification, proving someone reached for a paper door. Instead of panicking, the family follows a safety plan. Ask for records, add alerts, require in-person ID for changes, set a verbal password, and close the account the same day. Mrs. Lan uses their code word, oxygen, to steady herself, then signs with resolve. Outside, she admits she didn't run and chooses Tu Tieu again. Tu Tieu realizes the past hasn't vanished. It has simply lost its keys. Together, they turn fear into calm, practical closure.